So thank you very much for all the folks who are on here. My name is Gregory Maynard. I am the executive director of the Boston Policy Institute. We are the folks who commissioned Dr. Carrie Donahue to write this report. And so just to give you a background on Boston Policy Institute, we are a little bit more than, we're about 18 months old. We launched in December of 2023, and we're focused on doing original research, providing expert analysis and important resources on the most important challenges facing the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the city of Boston. And so this report is on an issue that BPI has been focused on from the very start, which is the agreement between the state and the city of Boston around BPS. This is something that BPI commissioned Aaron Cooley, who's an education expert, to do a series of analysis memos last year. And we were really happy with that work. And so we commissioned Kerry to do this report on the BPS agreement, a really deep dive on it. We think that this is the deepest dive, the most complete report on a state intervention into a school system that anyone has done. And this is something that, while it's focused on Boston around BPS, it's really also focused on the state. As folks are going to see, there's a lot of this is focused on state decision making here, and so it really demonstrates how closely aligned the state policy conversation and the local policy conversation are on BPS. Just to give you guys an agenda, I'm going to turn this over to Kerry in just a minute. She's going to give a presentation. This is the slide deck that folks got this morning from Joe Caiazzo. She's going to give the presentation. We have a couple of frequently asked questions that we've run into from folks over the course of kind of talking about draft versions of this report that I'm going to ask Kerry. And then after we do those three questions, we're going to open it up to reporters. And so I will call on folks and let folks talk. So I'll let people know so you can raise your hand when we hit that time. So now I am going to turn it over to the report's author, Carrie Donahue. Carrie, take it away.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you everyone for being here to sort of learn more about this report and really take a moment today to think about the state's intervention in the state's largest school district, the Boston Public Schools. I will run through this at a fairly high level, happy to answer more questions during the Q&A, as well as be available after if there are questions about sort of the details of the analysis of the report. And we have many charts and things like that I won't dive into fully, but are available to you to ask questions after. What I'll run through is first just how we got here, what preceded the state's intervention, what have been the results of that intervention, both in terms of compliance as well as the impact on student and school outcomes. And then the third thing that we'll discuss is what the options are for the future. So let me dive into how we actually got here, because I think it's important context for understanding, for assessing the impact of this intervention. The question that we're asking throughout this is, did the intervention actually change the things that it was intended to change? Why, when the state steps in and uses its authority to change on behalf of student progress, basically, you really want to see what, was that use of authority, did it result in the changes it intended? And so that's the question that we ask throughout this report. And what precipitated the state to use its authority in Boston was approximately almost several years of declining student performance. In addition, it was not just declining student performance, but the high concentration of students in the lowest performing schools in the state, which the state classifies as schools in the bottom 10%. And so when schools in a local district in Massachusetts fall into the bottom 10%, it then allows for this certain actions, the state to take certain intervention actions. And that's what we saw in Boston. And so this really began, the timeline really began in March 2020, 5 years ago from now. Most people obviously think of March 2020 as the start of the COVID pandemic, and when it really impacted our way of life, our public schools, and that is true. It also was the exact same time, month, and year when DESE released a district review that they had been conducting for months, that really took apart several of the systemic issues in the Boston public schools, and had really concerning findings around special education and systemic disarray, denial of access to grade level content for multilingual learners, segregation of both multilingual learners and special education students in the lowest performing schools in the district, and then many, many different operational failures, from buses to just basic things around bathrooms, health and safety in bathrooms, clean drinking water. Those were all the kinds of things that were kind of laid out in a very long district review that was released in March 2020. But at the same time that that review was released, it was also announced that there would be this unique, partnership between BPS and the state around improving the district in the form of an MOU with some clear areas of focus and some priority targets for the district to improve. So that all happened 5 years ago. Well, the MOU got superseded eventually by the Systemic Improvement Plan, which is the agreement that we're currently under right now, and which is set to expire in June 2025. The reason the Systemic Improvement Plan replaced the MOU is because the district did not make sufficient progress under the MOU. And so there was a new agreement, which was intended to kind of escalate the state's intervention. And you probably remember there was a lot of talk at that time around whether BPS would go into receivership. So, in a whole, it's basically been we've had 5 years of intervention under two agreements. There's been a change in mayoral administration over this time, and there's been a change in superintendent over this time. So actually, a lot has transpired in the environment around the district and in the governance of the district over this period. I already kind of went through the context of what sort of preceded the state's intervention, but I'll hit on a couple. First, student achievement in the district have been declining. There were historically low achievement for marginalized student groups at the time that the state intervened. There was a high concentration of students in the lowest performing schools. At that time, the state remarked in its district review that BPS's low performing schools would have been the fourth largest district in the state if taken together. So there were 34 schools in the bottom 10%. And then lastly, all of these sort of operational challenges. So now I want to share the highlights in terms of what we actually found when we went to look at what happened over the course of this intervention. And the way that we approached it in our analysis was really through two different methods. The first was we looked really for compliance. Like, did BPS do the things that it was asked to do on the MOU and then on the SIP? Did it do what it was asked to do by the state? And we looked at that through really examining each thing that was asked for. We think there was about 41 things that were asked for over the course of these two agreements. And we looked at, whether they met this, whether they partially met it, or whether it was not met, or whether we just can't tell. And sometimes you can't tell because reporting of these agreements and the transparency of what has transpired over these agreements really leaves a lot to be desired. In terms of BPS was very good actually about sharing the deliverables they submitted, at least in the SIP, which is the second agreement, but we have not consistent responses from DESE or an evaluation from the state on like, did those things they submitted actually meet the goals? So that is one of the challenges when interpreting these results. It probably leads us to be more generous, if anything, in assessing compliance. The second way that we approached evaluation of this intervention is something that we had to develop as unique for this, which is looking at the outcomes. Because neither of these agreements really specified outcomes that they sought to change. The MOU a little bit more than the SIP, but in general, were not a ton of emphasis placed on the outcomes that were supposed to change in terms of like real things for students, for schools, for families that were supposed to change as a result of the state's intervention. So what we did is we chose about 44 different outcome measures which span these different categories that those agreements really focused on: operations, academics, student safety and engagement, and the equity of student outcomes. And we looked at what changed from before the intervention to after. So what did we find? I want to run through just like a high level, and then I'll get into each of these five. What we found is that in general, this intervention has had a limited impact on student outcomes and school outcomes. There is very little to show in terms of progress, improvement, closing gaps, reducing the number of low performing schools from this intervention. It is not clear that it has really addressed the core things that lead the state to be able to intervene, which is around student and school performance. And at the same time, we found that the agreements really focus more on compliance and that BPS intended to do a better job of meeting the requirements that were compliance oriented. So let's get into each one of these findings. The first finding: academic outcomes did not improve, achievement gaps widened during this period, and there really is little evidence of pandemic recovery for students in Boston Public Schools, but in particular for Black and Latino students, low-income students, and multilingual learners and students with disabilities. Now, I'm highlighting these groups because actually white students and non-low-income students are back at, or if not above, their pre-pandemic performance. So some students in BPS have recovered from the learning losses experienced in the pandemic, but it is definitely a two-tier recovery. And many have pointed out that Boston Public Schools can be a two-tier system as experienced by students and families. And so what you'll see in these charts, I'm again not going to go through each one, but the blue represents before the pandemic, the red, or sorry, before the pandemic, and which would also align with before the state's intervention, and the red represents post intervention. So you can see here on the left-hand side that student achievement in each one of these MCAS areas is well below what it was before the state's intervention. And then we break down into some of the student groups. But there's more details in the slide deck and the report. And so happy to take more questions on this as we get to the end. The second thing, and this is important because again, the state's authority to intervene, their statutory authority really comes from the statute around intervention in low performing schools, which the state has to identify as being at the bottom 10%. And Boston had, at the time of this intervention, 34, and about 30% of its students were in those schools. The headline is that through this intervention, Boston has actually increased the share of students in the lowest performing schools in the state, in its district. It's increased the number of schools by 2. It went up from 34 to 36. And it has increased the share of high need students in those schools. All of those were things that were supposed to be reduced through the intervention. So all of them have gotten worse through the intervention period. And the last thing I'll just point to, sorry, is the outcomes of these schools. When taken together, the schools are lower performing today than they were prior to the intervention. So you can see, especially in the um, especially in the elementary and middle school grades, you have outcomes that are around the 10% range in ELA and math. And I know we're focusing a lot on MCAS in this presentation. In the report, we also look at things like post-secondary readiness and whether students are uh, actually moving and graduating and enrolling in college. And so there are more outcomes that we look at beyond MCAS as well in the full report. And the third finding, I'm going to switch a little bit to, okay, so you're telling me that academic performance has gotten worse, school quality and school performance has gotten worse, and we're concentrating more high need students in those schools. So what might be driving this? And what about these agreements could be part of why this is happening, why we're not seeing the results we wanted to see? And so, with the three findings that I have next are really about the agreements themselves and what they actually asked Boston to do. And so, the first thing I want to point out is that the agreements really focused on compliance over student and school outcomes, especially the SIP. For the SIP, there were 28 things asked for by the district, 25 of them were compliance oriented or administrative actions. And I'll give you an example: create a plan for, hire a person for this office, do a financial analysis of this, require schools to create a plan for. So it was a lot of administrative or compliance actions versus outcome oriented language that was in these agreements. The MOU, which BPS really struggled to do well with, actually had more student and school outcome oriented requests in them. It never specified targets for what was the specific target of the outcome, but they did, say increase the educational outcomes of transformation schools, versus once you got to the SIP, what's asked for in transformation schools is for schools to create a plan. So you kind of shifted more towards compliance in that second agreement than in the first one. So how did the district actually do on these agreements that, like I said, they're more oriented toward compliance, but how did they do? When we examined each of these agreements, like, everything that was required is about 41 different requirements. You see that what I mentioned, which is performance on the MOU, was a real challenge. They met about a little less than 40%. On the SIP, they met about 75% of the requirements. And so combined, we said that they meet about 63% if you take everything together. So it's a passing grade. They met the majority of their obligations. And I will also point out there was improvement. So it kind of shows that when the state does get involved and says these things need to be done, they did get done. And many of the things in the SIP were things that were long overdue and well documented. Things from having an inclusion policy for special education, things like cleaning, improving the bathrooms. These were things were all well documented for a long time, had not been done until the state stepped in and intervened. It's a separate question whether the state should be using its intervention authority for so many compliance oriented actions. So then the last thing I want to highlight is just there are still, even though, you have this 75% compliance rate of meeting the requirements on the SIP, there are a few operational priorities that are still incomplete, which were major reasons why the state intervened in the first place. So the bus on time rate has never really met that 95% target that was set out for, at least according to the last data that we have. And then, the idea of improving that first on time bus arrival was a significant challenge this year. It reached a historic low. And then in addition, I would say the other really critical priority that was in both the MOU and the SIP and was well documented as a major problem in the district review was the facilities utilization and lack of plan or theory around how the district was going to consolidate excess capacity in a way that advanced access to high quality schools in Boston. And that priority around the comprehensive long term master facility plan, while there was one submitted, DESE was very clear that that did not really fully meet what a comprehensive long term master facilities plan was. And what was submitted was more of a decision making framework versus an actual plan. So we also believe that that is not fully completed. And what you see in terms of the district is you still have there's still declining utilization rates in the district, and there are still a really small percentage of schools that have been renovated, and it's reaching a small percentage of students, although there has been improvement, and it seems like there are several projects in the pipeline. So, what to do next? We have these findings, low impact on student or school outcomes, some administrative changes that were long overdue, some operational priorities advanced, but still some missing that were identified in the original MOU. And so, what options are available? We really see this decision really sits with the state in the lead of deciding what are they going to do. Their first option would be, well, let's call this a success. We've met, at least a somewhat of a passing grade in total here, and the state intervention. That's the first option. The second option would be to do what was done when we went from the MOU to the SIP, which is essentially initiate a third improvement agreement that's going to address the unmet priorities, which I would say are heavily around student and school outcomes, and then the facilities planning and the bus transportation. And then the third would be to actually escalate the intervention by designating BPS as an underperforming district, which is a statutory and regulatory term, which comes with specific state mandated requirements around an approved district improvement plan that the commissioner would approve. And so these are the three options that we see the state having in front of it. There also is another set of options, which I'm not totally getting into here, but because BPS has 36 schools in the bottom 10%, there's interventions the state could be taking for each one of those schools or those schools also collectively. And so we can talk about that in the Q&A as well if you're interested. But of these three, we see the first as not viable. There are too many critical priorities that have not been met yet in this intervention to proceed down this path. And it would really just represent just yet another sort of set of surface level reforms that don't really get at the systemic factors, which was the whole point of the state intervention. And then the third one, we don't see that one as viable at this point because it would escalate things before giving, I think, another chance to come to a compromise agreement that is really focused on student and school outcomes. And so we think it would just become too much of a distraction for the escalation of the state's intervention versus let's positively build on the progress of the SIP and by initiating a next agreement. But we think there need to be some key changes of the agreement in order to not end up in the same place that we currently are. And some of those key changes, I would say the headline is let's make this agreement more outcomes focused, more focused on student outcomes, school outcomes, and improving the overall performance of the district in a more measurable way and having some progress markers. Part of why this review was so challenging to do is those things did not exist, and we really had to examine and put our own outcome measures to assessing the progress because the state and nor BPS did not set out what actual tangible progress would look like as far as this agreement. The second thing that we think it needs to include is much more clarity around what the district is doing to transform access to high quality schools and to move students from schools in the bottom 10% schools to schools that are higher achieving, higher performing. And that can be done through investment in improving schools. It can also be done in there are other options for that, but there needs to be some explicit accountability there. On this, the third thing we see as key for this agreement is that DESE is actually appointing a independent accountability lead to really bring much more transparency to this whole process. We've had these agreements in place, and there's been very little attention, very little clarity about whether they're actually doing what they were intended to do. And we think that that's a real constraint. And so there needs to be much more accountability to the students and families that this intervention is resulting in needed changes. It can't just continue to be a sweeping under the rug of things and sort of checking boxes. And so we are recommending that DESE appoint an independent accountability lead that would be focused on the implementation of the agreement and the pursuit of the outcomes outlined in the agreement. And then the fourth thing, and I kind of already spoke to this, is just monthly progress reporting and much more transparency as far as what's happening. And so those are all the things that we would put to state decision makers. And I think this comes at just a really critical time where the state is thinking about, what is its role in accountability, as we see also a federal government struggling with and kind of having for years now really backed off on the concept of accountability. And what we've seen when we be able to look at the national context is that many students, especially historically marginalized students, have really suffered under this sort of weakening of accountability. And so now the question is sitting at the state level, as it has for some time, and we're interested to see which pathway they choose or what options they'll be considering, and how they actually evaluate the success of this intervention, as well as the few other times that the state has intervened in school districts. And so I welcome your questions and appreciate your listening and your interest in this topic.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie. So there's one kind of question that we received a couple of times while we were previewing this for folks. And it was so last year, BPS announced that they were no longer in the bottom 10% of schools. And there was some discussion around that as meaning that the state wasn't going to be able to take some actions that were previously contemplated to improve performance at BPS. Can you talk about how moving out of the bottom 10% of school districts affects or doesn't affect Boston's, like the state's ability to still take action at BPS?
Yes, thank you. So the it is true that Boston Public Schools has moved out of one of the lowest performing 10% of districts in the state, and that is largely a reflection of declining performance in other districts versus progress in BPS. But these things are all relative, and what the state's authority there means it cannot put the district into receivership. It does not mean that the state doesn't have authority to intervene on behalf of addressing major deficiencies in student and school outcomes, which, because of the 36 schools that BPS still has in the bottom 10%, it is still going to be subject to some amount of state intervention. And honestly, when you look at the number of schools, several of BPS's schools have been in state intervention status for close to a decade. I think, like I was looking, Madison Park has been in some sort of state intervention status for the last 10 years, which obviously raises questions about what that intervention is doing at the school level. But it would allow the state could move on receiverships for several of these 36 schools, and it still is able to use its authority to cite the district as underperforming, which comes with some of these other statutory requirements.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we're going to open this up to questions now. So if any of the folks on here have questions, if you want to raise your hand and I will I'll click your button here and you can ask a question. All right. So, all right, so I have one, I'll give folks a couple more minutes. So I have one other. The report finds that BPS has completed 63% of the MOU and SIP compliance actions. I know you talked about it a little bit, but like, can you talk about like how those are, like how those, if there's any weighting into that, or like how those decisions, like how you came to the 63% number?
Yeah, so there is not waiting. So basically, we looked at the agreements and they outline a number of like priorities, or say, BPS will do this thing. And we really are counting them all equal. And we know that they're not really all equal in terms of weight and importance. Or even the difficulty to execute. So some, things might be hiring an official to do something or do a plan or hire a consultant to conduct an audit. And we're counting that as the same as, achieve an on time bus rate of 95%. And I think that's because it would be too subjective to assign weights, but there are just clearly some priorities that were consistently clearly more important and were cited in both agreements and were cited in the district review as being critical to be addressed.
Great. And those are all in the table. So we've got a question here
Mhm.
from Yawu Miller. Yawu, you're on. Oh, you're muted. Hi, Yawu. Oh, okay. Yeah, if you I mean yeah, but just you asked the question here, I can. Mhm, mhm, sure. Sure. So the state has a checkered, this is from Yahoo Miller. The state has a checkered history of interventions in Boston at the Dever and at other schools. Can you talk about what can be different about those interventions? Is that talk what can be different about those interventions?
Yeah, I think what should be different is understanding what, if anything, worked about them and what has not, and using that to inform a path forward. I also think there are one of the things that I see as challenging, and this is more just opinion than based in evidence necessarily, is that the state tends to manage its intervention in Boston like the same as every other district. And I think that's a real challenge in terms of like you need to get at some of the more underlying systemic factors that are leading, especially concentration of certain students and student groups in certain schools, and then those schools being underinvested in or not having the amount of supports that are needed. And so I think that's part of why they wanted to do this MOU, I think, versus do the school by school interventions that had failed in the past. But I think the problem is the MOU or the SIP, like they just didn't really act on some of the root causes. And even the acting commissioner in his last memo or only memo about this intervention in May noted that the district really had not addressed any of the root causes of significantly underperforming schools, despite being in compliance with the things that the SIP had asked them to do. And so I think it's been, they didn't repeat maybe some of the things that were failed in the past, but they didn't really do anything that actually was going to address student performance. And so I think the things that need to be done really have to do with addressing some of the systemic factors that are sort of concentrating students in low performing schools, and then addressing really going after teacher capacity, and helping to support teachers, lots of professional development and support, recruiting, the right leaders to be in the building, supporting them, all the things that more time for student learning, like there's just a number of things that I would get to into the weeds on from an education perspective, but resources that could be invested in a really robust school transformation strategy that we just really have not seen, and the state has not really pushed for that or required that out of the district.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Our next question here is from John Hilliard from the Boston Globe. Go ahead, John.
Thanks again, Carrie, Greg, for taking the time for this. Kind of a two-part question, and it's a little bit in the weeds, but just to get your take on it. One is big picture. This improvement plan covers a huge amount of ground. I was wondering, from your research on this, was this too much all in one big agreement? Because it goes from everything from, transportation to inclusion to English language learners, all these other issues, school safety. There's a lot in this one document, all in a one
Mhm,
3-year plan. Did they take on
mhm.
too much in one thing and made it hard for the state to keep on top of BPS? The other part of it is more mechanical. How did the state DESE go about ensuring compliance with the different steps? Were they just relying on BPS reports? Did they have inspectors go into the schools? Can you talk a little bit about what was going on for the reporting part of this?
Yeah, let me start with the reporting. I mean, from what we can see is they relied a lot on BPS reports. They did meet with BPS representatives, and we were able to look at some minutes from those meetings, but not minutes, agendas, I think, from the meetings, not minutes. So that's not really clear from even looking at that what real accountability was in those meetings. Um, and there was very little, I would say, follow up in terms of the states really making sure, things are changing and that deliverables are actually meeting the intention of the agreement and why the state is intervening in the first place. And so it's very hard to see what was done there. Now, again, it could have been happening in these, monthly or quarterly meetings, but we have no way to really verify that. And all we're looking at is kind of the output. So that's, I would say, the reporting and sort of monitoring leaves a lot to be desired. I'm sure it has to do with capacity and all the things that were happening, obviously, at the state during this time, but it doesn't change the fact that that is something that probably would need to be addressed in a new agreement, and why we recommend like a sole accountability lead that is focused explicitly on Boston and not like trying to oversee several different districts with state intervention at the same time. The next question you had, which was, sorry, remind me the first. Oh, it was a bigger picture question. Just can you restate it?
He wanted to know about if it was too if the agreement was trying
Oh,
to touch around.
too big in scope. Okay, so I think this is opinion um, that I would have to give. I think that the agreement was large in scope, and the challenge is that there were so many. I think it could have been as large in scope, but should have picked fewer requirements in it and maybe put down like had some of the requirements that were just so administrative as maybe it could have been an interim progress marker, but I think it was too it didn't there were too many like steps, and I think it should have kept the focus on sort of big shifts that needed to happen: inclusion, master facilities plan, transformation schools. I think if you had like those three, that probably would have been, I don't know what would have changed the outcomes, but it would have been more manageable from a monitoring perspective, which we can see that it was very difficult for DESE to monitor this large agreement.
Yeah, and John, just to add on here, just to, from separate from kind of what the report says, just from kind of BPI's like why we're doing this report now is because the agreement with the state doesn't end until June 2025. And so if you look back at 2022, this agreement was hammered out over the course of March, April, May, and June, 3 years ago. And so that's like a good, a good question about how much ground was covered and what should come next, like what BPS should do next. And we feel like putting this report out now gives the district and the state and all of the different stakeholders who are involved here, from elected officials to parents, time to kind of process this, think about how it's gone, and then figure out what to do next. So like our hope is that this report is not the only one that gets produced by someone. We'd like to see what BPS thinks about how they've done on compliance with this, how the state thinks they've done on compliance with this, right? Pat Tutwiler was just appointed the acting DESE commissioner last night, so he's going to have a big role in this as both education secretary and DESE commissioner. And so we think there's a chance for a really robust discussion here about what should happen next at BPS. Does anyone have any more questions? Put up your hands. Otherwise, so just so folks know, both Carrie and I are available to talk to folks. I think folks have my phone number. You can talk to Joe and we can connect with them. And our press conference is over, Pierre. So our embargo is lifted. So publish away. But thank you so much for coming. Yeah, Carrie just stuck her phone number in the chat if you have any questions. That's 603-498-0623. And yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Thank you.